Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Michael Jones. I'm one of the partners here at Bevan Buckland, and we're going to be running through a session this afternoon regarding building financial reserves for charities and some common questions that we see coming across. Jonathan Dyke was meant to be with us, but unfortunately he's been called away last minute. So you have to sort of bear with me. It'll just be sort of me at the moment, but I've got sort of Amy in the background who's running the sort of slides. For any questions, she'll be sort of picking those up. A couple more. There we go. So first of all, this is just a sort of message for trustees. Just to let you know, it's the trustees fundamentally are responsible for setting and monitoring a reserves policy. And this covers all aspects of the policy itself. So that determines whether you want to hold reserves, what that level needs to be, what risks the charity faces, what are the needs of the charity, what are the strategy of the charity. It also ties into what the sort of policy is and what that value sort of comes back to. It's not something that is just written once and sort of set in stone. This is something that should follow the needs of the charity and any sort of changes to any particular circumstance. So, when you're the way that the funding works, that we know that sometimes funding will get tight. Other times we've seen charities where they've got significant amounts of funding as well. And what you need to consider is what's the right level for the charity. Holding too little can be seen as a negative, and at the same time, holding excessive funds can also be seen as not managing your funds well. So it's something that needs to get factored into the policy itself. When you're actually looking through, so trustees themselves, as part of this process, you need to develop what that policy is. So before holding any funds, it's why you're holding it. So it's looking at justifying the reserves that you need to keep. It's looking at what the plans are for the charity. So we're seeing charities now trying to align their vision or their sort of strategic plan with the reserves policy. So trying to get it into relatively sort of short term or sort of short cycles. So how much do we need for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, as well as then looking at any projects that you'd like to sort of fund outside of what your current remit would be. And looking at it as well, it's a case of who are your beneficiaries? So what's the service that you're providing? How much funds do you need to sort of keep back just to make sure that the service to them will be maintained? In case there is a cut in funding, you want to be acting responsibly and making sure that any beneficiaries are safeguarded. We know that funding can be tight, and there can be occasions where funding is cut at relatively short notice, and it could have a knock-on effect on charities where there could be an unplanned closure. So from a trustee's point, it's a case of these need to be sort of factored into that policy just to make sure that you can wind down a charity as formally as possible. And especially if you're dealing with vulnerable beneficiaries, how do you make sure that they're safeguarded if the worst does happen that wasn't planned? When you actually develop your policy, it's then making sure that it's published and you sort of actually it's tailored to what the circumstances are. So we see lots of accounts coming through, and so that reserves policy within the account, so within any of your documentation, can't be what the class is of boilerplate wording. It's got to be something that is actually true to the charity and it's sort of written from your perspective. It also helps then explain to funders why you're holding reserves, who your beneficiaries are, and sort of why or why not you're keeping them. So it gives a bit of visibility then to the outside world. From an operational side, you have your policy sort of set in place, and it's your responsibility to make sure the charity follows that policy. And you sort of do monitor it as you go through. So a couple of little bits there from a sort of trustee's point over the reserves. When you become a larger charity, so any sort of charities that are sort of over 500,000 of income, you're required to sort of report your policy within your accounts as well. So it is important that you know what your policy is and how it gets shown. So moving on to onto reserves themselves now. So can you flick through? Go to slide 5 if you could. There you go. So what are reserves? So we always get asked the question, what are the reserves in the charity? So charity reserves, especially what is classed as free reserves, are an element of unrestricted funds. So for those that have sets of accounts in front of them, if you've got a balance sheet, so that's sort of noting everything that the charity owns and owes at a particular point. It's anything that's classified as unrestricted. But there's also a couple of exceptions there. So things that aren't classed as reserves will be some tangible fixed assets. So that could be land and buildings, it could be motor vehicles, it could be any equipment or fixtures that you've got. But they're not classed as reserves. You could have investments, so that could be investments in other organizations, in subsidiaries. They're also excluded from the calculation as well. Designated funds, once it sort of comes out of the pot, if you've ring-fenced them for a particular purpose, that comes out of your free reserves pot, and any commitments that you've made to fund or to pay any liabilities are also excluded. And this also only covers unrestricted reserves, so any restricted balances are excluded there. So it gives you a breakdown of how to come to the free reserves level. And it gives a good feel for how solvent the charity would be. And then come on to why we hold the reserves. So when you've actually done that sort of calculation, you've got an idea for what you've got as a free reserve. So it's the extra reserves sort of sitting there. What are we using them for? So charities hold them as part of their financial planning. It's an important part of charities and governance to make sure that you are looking ahead and what's likely to come and forecasting what can come in the future. Nobody's got a crystal ball. It is a difficult thing to manage, but knowing you've got a pot of funds there that can be used helps to safeguard the charity, and it provides a little buffer for anything that could be unforeseen that pops up. So a couple of reasons as to why charities hold the reserves. So it's managing risk, so we've done a previous session on risk itself, but looking at sort of the risks that come in. So it could be an unplanned cut in funding. It could be an increase in costs that you weren't expected. There could be some building repairs that need to be urgently undertaken. And if you haven't got a pot there, how would you fund those costs? Continuity of service, we've seen there's this time of crisis or sort of transition between different providers. How do you make sure your service continues? We've got a number of charities where the service was fully funded for a few years. The trustees really appreciated the work that was done by the team. The beneficiaries found the service very useful, but then funding was cut. But the charities in question, they had a pot of funding sort of set aside, and the trustees took the decision to continue that service for additional 12 months. So it gives you that room to continue dealing with users, especially when they've got a significant need. And then looking for long term, we want to see charities that are operating for 10, 20 years on its own without the need for grant funding. So, if you can build reserves up, it allows you to plan for the future. It allows you to look at ways of increasing your incomes. That could be setting up a trading subsidiary or looking at other avenues for generating funds. So it allows you to future plan just by having the reserves there. So coming on to policies themselves. So if you actually look at the Charity Commission, I say it does give some very good guidance, and this is sort of what we base some of our slides on, and it breaks it down into a number of areas. So, what's the importance of having a reserves policy? The reserves policy explains internally and externally, so whether that's funders, donors, staff, other beneficiaries as to why you're holding a particular amount of reserves. So first and foremost, it's making them aware that you are doing your duties as a trustee, as a team. You know why you're holding them and what the plans are. It gives then comfort to stakeholders that the finances are being properly managed, and it gives an idea for what any future funding needs would be. So every time you're going for funding, the funders will be looking at your accounts. It'll be looking at what your policies are. The more you can explain why you're holding a policy and what your requirements are, or how you plan to spend them, will always help you in that process. It's not going to guarantee what the funding would be, but at least it saves the funder having to come back to you with any questions. From an internal side, working out what that level of reserves needs to be is very important. It's part of what management and financial planning would be within the charity. And if you didn't actually undertake that process, then it could result in reserves that are either too high. So funders look at the accounts, see the reserves are too high, and then do question whether you're actually performing your duties and carrying out the events and services that you should be. And conversely, when you've then got reserves that are too low, there could be concerns around governance or funding, especially if someone's then looking to fund the charity. They may have concerns as to, is the service going to be provided? Is our money going to be spent appropriately? So making sure that you've actually got a policy on reserves that sort of sets out the level that you need, explaining why you hold them is a very good thing to be put into your accounts if you're small, and so when you're larger, you are required to do it as well. So it's good practice to get into that mindset for writing the policy and making sure that you monitor it. So come on to creating a policy. So we touched on why it's important. So now what do we then do to actually create a policy? There is no single method of doing it. Every charity is different. The service and the size of charities ranges from charities that are very small, being run by trustees, up to large corporate charities run by boards and multiple sort of teams beneath them. So the range of charities is phenomenal. So you can't just have one policy that fits all. So it needs to reflect your need. It needs to reflect the size of the charity, the complexity of the charity, what your legal structure is, and what the actual needs of the organization are. But there are some basic fundamentals to follow. So things to consider, it's looking at the nature of the funds that are being held by the charity. So, have we got restricted funds and unrestricted funds? Do we get any endowment funds that are sort of paid in? Is it something that can be spent? Are there any restrictions on sort of funding that are coming in? And what are the purposes of spending the funding? So that's looking at what your needs are, looking at the uncertainties. So the future planning, it's a case of, do we know whether there's been sort of cuts to funding? Have we got any sort of short-term funding projects that may only be 1 or 2 years? What's our plan thereafter? Are there any additional funding pots that we need to then be targeting to try and make up this shortfall? When you're a larger charity, it's a case of, could there be cuts to other funding, or if you've got significant cash there, what are the opportunities for the charity? So that it's not always negative. It's a case of how are we going to use this money for bettering the charity and actually sort of generating some income. For larger charities, we sort of tend to find that they've probably got more strategic and operational plans, but it's something that all charities should be sort of thinking of sort of moving forward. Look at then the policy that the charity has. We don't see as many, but some charities will have a zero level policy. It's not to say that it's wrong. Some charities want to spend all the money that they earn on on needs for end users, and it's a case of right, let's write the policy up. Why are we doing it? Why do we think that's the best way of doing it? Because it does create additional risk. So if you haven't got any sort of reserves or anything to fall back on, if there was an unexpected cost or an unexpected bill that you hadn't sort of planned for, wasn't in your original forecast or your original spend, how are you going to sort of fund that cost? So it could have a knock-on effect with the charity itself. But we do see some that are 100% grant funded. Everything comes out with the grant. It's funded in advance, so the pot is there. So you've got the fallback of the grant to be able to run that way. So it's not wrong, but it's a case of you need to consider why it's appropriate for the charity itself. And then it comes down to when you've written it, it's then making sure that you actually write up the policy. So when you come to preparing your accounts, you should have a policy statement explaining why you need it, how you've set it up, and what the value would be. And it doesn't mean you've got to hit that in year one. There could be an aim for we plan to hold X amount of reserves, and it's going to be built up over a couple of years, just so you can see what that policy will be. And just by sort of running through these sort of couple of steps, so when you're sort of thinking of it, it gives you an idea for what we need, and it'll help decide the amount of reserves that you need. So what level of reserves are required? So flick through. And again, there is no one size fits all, so there's a little bit of do a bit of research yourself, look at what your plans are. But any sort of target that the trustees have as to what they want to be achieving moving forward needs to sort of come into the plan and to work out what you actually need to capture. So, looking through what you need to be looking at what your income forecasts are. So, how much income you're currently getting, how much is going to come in the next 12 months, the next sort of 2 years. Is there going to be a cut? Is there going to be additional sources of funding? Is that likely to give us more money? Is there going to be a squeeze on budgets? The other side is looking at your expenditure. So everyone can see what has been spent previously, but it's doing a little bit of forecasting and see how much is it going to cost us moving forward. What comes out of budgets. So the government budgets, there'll be increased costs. Make sure those are all factored in as well, just to give you an idea for how much funding you need to actually cover. Is there a shortfall? Try and sort of tackle it then any future plans or any either projects you've committed to, projects you'd like to undertake, or any risks that sort of may come on board. So if you're planning on buying a building in 2 years' time, how much reserves do we need to generate just to have that extra cash there to help with the purchase? So it's weighing up your future income against your future costs. That then gives you a balance as to how much you're going to need. We see a number of charities then bringing in some contingency reserves just to make sure they've got an extra sort of little pot there. Others will have a specific project that they're raising funds towards. So, they'll be designating that money to a particular area until they get the amount fully funded. But, looking for any shortfall. So if you've identified that it's going to cost you more than the income you're going to generate, how are you planning on managing it? Is this something that is going to come out of existing reserves? Will there be cutbacks to costs if possible? Are there any other income streams you can work towards just to bridge that gap as well? So it'll help with risk assessing. It'll help with sort of strategic planning just to make sure that it helps drive the team to generate those funds. And then looking, if you decide on a very low reserves policy, it's how do you make sure what's the minimum cost or minimum reserve that you need? If you had to plan for an orderly closure, making sure that staff have been remunerated accordingly. If you have any vulnerable beneficiaries, how do you make sure they're safeguarded? You'll be able to put a rough cost on that, and that'll sort of drive your your policy, and it may even give you a steer for monitoring the funds. So when it gets to that level, you have to sort of start that process earlier. It's better to do it under your control than suddenly have issues with funding later on. So then looking on, what steps are required to maintain reserves. So one, it's making sure you've got your policy in place. Two, it's making sure that you do review it. We know that charities do change. Charities will grow, charities will expand into different areas. The We've seen a number where they originally started off at £100,000 of income, and they're now up to close to £1 million worth of income. So the needs of the charity have grown tenfold. So making sure that that policy is still fit for purpose is something that we'd always recommend, and doing it as part of an annual update. I think that'll sort of give you a good feel moving forward, especially when it comes to budgets. Lots of charities do budgets, so tying this in at the same time will be good practice for you. But looking at monitoring them then. So once potentially know how to maintain it, what you need to cover, monitoring the reserves will almost come into your management reporting. So if you've got a plan for spending them as part of your monthly or your quarterly reporting, have an idea for this is how much we've spent, whether there's a deficit at that particular point, with a ring fence as to how much has come out to reserves, just so you can see are we spending in line with what we planned to spend, how long is it going to last? If we plan to use it for 12 months, it should run relatively smoothly for the 12 months. But if you've spent it all or half of the reserve within the first 2 or 3 months, how are you actually going to sort of stretch it out for the remaining 9 months as well? So it allows you to monitor the spend, but at the same time, if it's running away with you, you can sort of take corrective action early. The other side is if you've got a plan for how much you should be holding as reserves, if then you're not spending as much money as you should be, so the surpluses are increasing far quicker than you thought, is that a time to sort of step in and actually work out, yes, we need to spend more, we need to take on an extra member of staff, we need to look at providing additional services, run an extra workshop, whatever that sort of needs may be, just to sort of make sure that you're not building up excessive reserves for the size of the charity. Looking at sort of shortfalls, if you're below target, whether that is a short-term problem, is it a long-term problem? How are you going to actually correct that shortfall? Reviewing is probably one of the important things to say. If you're not reviewing your finances, whether that's your day-to-day operating, your quarterly reporting, and your reserves, they all tie in together, and making sure you do a good review helps just to steer the charity and puts you in good stead moving forward. Making sure your policy is adapted. So, as a charity evolves, the needs of the charity will evolve, and any reserves will also need to be amended for that. So, if you have grown and you have set up a trading subsidiary, there's additional requirements to make sure that is funded where the previous year it wouldn't have been even part of a calculation. So constantly evolving is something we'd recommend you keep on looking for. And as I said, just making sure that your policy then within the accounts also updates. Quite often these are static paragraphs within a set of accounts. The accountants will typically ask to make sure that your trustees report's up to date, which will contain your reserves policy, but more often than not, it's always the activities of the year. They always get updated because everyone wants to see what has been done and what end users have been engaged with and services you've been provided. But so making sure that your reserves policy also reflects where you currently are is also very important. So looking at how you'd explain it in your annual report. So there's a couple of little bits there. So there's requirements for all charities. So one, to make sure you've got a reserves policy in your annual report, so stating the level of reserves, why they're held, what the need is. Then you're looking at the designated funds. So if you've got any designated funds, again, it's explaining the purpose for the designation. These can always change. So whilst it may be designated in year one, you've managed to then get a funding. So instead of using your reserves, you manage to get external funding for it. These reserves are being freed up and they're used for a different purpose next year. Again, just sort of explain the reasons for the changes in the year. When it comes to larger charities, it's a little bit more structured. There is a set requirement for reporting. So it's stating the amount that were held at the year end. It's noting any funds where there could be restrictions. So you are noting restricted funds. The explanation for the restricted funds, typically it'll be noting who the funder is and what the purpose for those funds are. It'll be more explanation around designated funds. So we see a number of designated funds within the accounts themselves. They could be fixed assets have been designated because you've got a building that is held within reserves. There could be an extension being built next year, so they want to sort of put money aside to cover those. There could be some costs for a new member of staff in the next year. So there'll be a number of funds that are ring fenced. So again, it's just a little bit of explanation for what they are. If there are any funds that relate to fixed assets, it's ideal to sort of separate them out because these are sort of tied into something that isn't readily available to turn into cash. So the only way of realizing that would be to sell the assets. So highlighting those as part of your policy is something that's worth doing. And then so compare what you've got in your policy with what the accounts are actually sort of showing as well. So it's monitoring that level of what the reserves are, what we'd expect it to be, and what steps we're taking to either spend the money or to sort of generate the additional funds to get them both to align. So what if the charity has no or excess reserves? So looking at your policy, if you've got insufficient reserves, which some charities do, and some very large charities do as well, which we'll sort of touch upon later, it's a case of if you are going to spend it, why you are spending that way, why the charities are adopting that policy. It is going to create a risk, so. What are the plans to mitigate those risks? What's your budgeting sort of moving forward? What's the noting that policy in the accounts? It does give comfort then to end users that you do know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and it's what the plans are for the charity, and it's the best way of operating. So it's just making sure that any unforeseen risks are flagged. And excessive reserves, so if you've got reserves that are far more than what your policy would be, so that you know that your current year's plans are going to cost you, say, £25,000, but you've got 100,000 in reserve, what you're going to do to actually spend that money because you're holding more reserves than you need to. So it's generally good. So if the policies are, if your reserves are high, note in your policy, one, it lets the Charities Commission know, and two, it lets the end users know as to why you've got them. So it gives you an explanation to note, why you're holding up, what your plans are. So anyone looking in can actually see, yes, this charity knows what they're doing. They've got projects lined up for the next 2 years. They're being well managed. And it could be the other side, you've got the reserves there and you haven't managed to recruit the people you want to deliver the service. So you're struggling to spend it. You've got plans to spend it, but at the moment it's more of a timing issue to actually spend the funds rather than holding them inappropriately. So lots of this is a case of how you build up your policy. So, it's looking at forecasts, looking at what your operations are moving forward, trying to factor in any unforeseen risks that you've got to give you a number that would be your reserves number. Historically, people would be sort of looking at 6 months running costs. Others will look at, well, we would have had 12 months, some will be three. What is that number for you? Just to make sure that you've got that number that you can then sort of monitor and report on. What we've got a couple of examples for. I've gone through some of the larger charities just to explain how their policies are. So these are just lifted from their accounts, so I'm not expecting you to be able to read what's in there, but just to show how they vary across different charities. So pick those some key bits there. The British Legion, so top paragraph there, they've got free reserves just to continue their service, kind of keep continuing moving forward, especially for their funding, because they're heavily dependent on volunteer support and donations. Lots of their funding typically comes in for the Poppy appeal. What happens if COVID sort of strikes again, and they lose that level of funding? So they look at where their donations coming from and how they're ring fencing those just to make sure that they're stable. They've also got some care homes, so they've factored in the need for reduced fee income, lower occupancy, additional costs. So they've got another sort of string there, and they've also got amounts on investment. So what happens if the investment value drops? The last thing they'd want to do is have to sell the investment at a low value. So how do they make sure that they're safeguarded? So coming to the bottom of the page there, they've got a minimum requirement of 60 million. Yes, it's a significant number, but that's the number that they've come to. So, their policy is noting, what the value of the minimum that they need is. They also note how much they've actually got in reserves. So they've actually got 88.5 million. So they're holding more than what their actual reserve level is. But then they've also got a note to say how they plan to use it. So, they're looking at expanding their welfare provision, they're expanding their emergency support. They're looking at sort of dealing with the community for cost of living crisis, and the time scale for spending it. So they're looking to spend it over the next sort of 2 or 3 years. So, a very well noted report. It sort of shows that they've considered where all their income comes from, what their outgoings are, and how they sort of plan on spending it. Next one, Amy, if you could. So Nuffield Health, so complete opposite side now. So obviously we've got British Legion trying to hold lots of reserves in case in case funding gets hit. Well, Nuffield Health haven't actually set a reserves target. They're trying to spend all of their reserves, so that they're trying to use all of their cash reserves to actually reinvest in infrastructure and quality of service. So they're not planning on holding a significant amount of free reserves. The policy then goes in to explain the value they've got. There's a significant amount of land and buildings in there, and they've actually made an adjustment to their accounts to actually hold the land and buildings at fair value, to actually give them a surplus position, because they think it better reflects what their accounts are. But again, it's a very detailed policy. It's explaining, what the values are, what the reserves amounts were at the previous year with a comparative. It's showing the amount of unrestricted reserves. It's showing how much is held in land and buildings. So it's giving the end user, one, it gives them comfort for how stable the charity is, and how well protected they are. At the same time, telling them that they are going to be spending all the cash. Flicking on to National Trust, they've got a policy. They've got a minimum policy that they want to be looking at. Their policy is to exclude fixed assets as part of their policy, and exclude the pension fund. So what they've looked at, they've got a value in there of 225 million, but how they've done it, they've looked at short-term fluctuations. They've looked at long-term strategic planning. They've looked at funding for unplanned projects. They've looked at any circumstances that should the charity cease to operate, how they protect the expenditure should there be market validity, and how to make sort of strategic investments. So again, they're looking at it from a number of different areas. So good practice as to what they've looked at, and they've come back to so the 225. They've again noted what the value of the reserves are, how much it's moved by, and how much they're above the threshold. So again, a well thought out, well documented policy for the National Trust. And then the last one we've got is cancer research. So again, they want to make sure they've got cash and cash available, relatively short term, and covering 3 to 5 months of running costs. So, we've got 4 examples here, and as you can see, all four are different. I think these are 4 out of the top 10 largest charities in the UK, and think, well, if those 4 haven't got a uniform policy, then it sort of shows that every charity is different. These have approached it slightly differently, so they've got a little sort of table in there, and they've actually flagged what their typical commitments are. And they've also noted that they've got commitments for the next sort of 5 years, that they've actually factored that into their accounts. So they've brought it onto their balance sheet, and it flows through into their reserves policy. And then also their reserves policy is they're only looking on cash, so they're looking at sort of managed cash and liquid investments. So rather than total reserves, they try to do it on cash reserves. So again, a slightly different way of doing it, highlighting how much they need for sort of 3 to 5 months, and sort of building their policy around that. So hopefully some good examples as part of trying to explain how this runs. And then what we've seen, so the last slide, what we've got then is a sort of couple of questions that we see being asked. So we can flick through. Amy, I think it's on to one more. There we go. So can a charity invest its reserves? Yes, it can. As there's nothing stopping a charity investing its reserves. There's policies and procedures around investment, so it's making sure that you are investing in the right things, but actually investing in sort of short to medium term to generate cash. Yes, that's a part of good governance. So yes, you can invest them. There's a flag then for fundraising and applying for grants. So it's a case of anyone external is looking at the confidence in the charity, sort of from the public, making sure that you are open and transparent about the needs for funds. If you need reserves, explaining why and how it all gets noted there. If you're applying for a grant, looking for a contract, again, the funder wants to know what your policy is. So when it's in the accounts, it just makes it far easier to get through that process. There's one sort of noted about what the legal basis for holding reserves are. Generally, you're expected to spend your reserves, within a reasonable time frame, but there are some charities that are able to hold funds. So if your governing document sort of notes, you can get cases there to hold reserves, so you actually hold it rather than sort of spending it promptly. So there's a couple of little questions that we've sort of seen pop up. We had a question sort of pre the webinar asking if someone had donated gold to a charity, how would that get accounted for? So from a reserves point, the donation comes in as income. With the gold, then you have to sort of look at what your plans are for the gold. So if it was a case of we've had it come in, we're planning on selling it in the next sort of 12 months, we're going to sort of turn it into cash. You'd sort of hold it then as a current asset, and it would sort of come into your free reserves calculation. If it's there to be held sort of long term, sort of then deemed a fixed asset investment, it would sort of come onto further up your balance sheet. It would be long term, and it's probably best not include it in your free reserves because it's not part of the plan of the charity to sell them. Um, Depending on the size of the charity, you may have to then, if you're currently doing receipts and payments accounts, it should be noted in your statement of assets and liabilities. If you're a charity then preparing accounts under the SOAP, you'd have this would be part of your balance sheet. I think I'm seeing a question just pop up in the chat asking, is there a minimum level? So the Charities Commission doesn't actually set a number. That's so most of this guidance is from the Charities Commission. So it's all looking at what your circumstances are. So even if you went down 3 months running costs, so 3 months running costs for 10 different charities probably give you 10 different amounts. So it's looking at what the circumstances are for your charity itself. So what your plans are. The Charities Commission aren't going to give you a basis because every charity will be different. So it's more of a steer for let's have a look to see what we're planning on doing, what the charity's aims are over the next 12, 24, 36 months, and how is that going to be funded? If it's all by agreed grant funding, you're not going to need the reserves to meet those spends. If it's a case of this is something we want to do, we want to grow, we want to acquire our own building, well, actually generating enough reserves and holding enough reserves to let that happen will give you a target to work towards. So lots of it sort of ties in with forward planning, both from where we want to be if we're looking to grow, or worst case scenario from a close down if costs are going up and funding's being cut. How are we going to fund this? Have we got the free reserves to allow us to do so, or what is that level that we need to be mindful of just to make sure that we are carrying out our trustee responsibilities and looking at a closure if worst case happens. But it's if you can tie it in with future, if you can tie it in with your budget setting and sort of strategic meetings, that's the best place to do so. I think that's the last slide we've got, so I haven't seen any other questions. That everyone on here will get a copy of these as well. We'll also send out a copy of the pack that goes with it as a bit of guidance. And if you've got any other questions, please feel free to shout. Otherwise, have a good afternoon and hopefully catch you on the next webinar. So it's likely to be in the autumn. Details will be announced sort of closer to the date. But thank you all for attending and see you all soon.